Okay, we can start, I guess. Welcome, everyone, to the Developers on Air session this week. And as usual, it's brought to you by DeCodEd, DeCodEd Africa. We are a developer-focused platform that enables digital creatives to learn, meet, and grow sustainably and to fill the jobs of the future. That's our role, and that's how we've partnered with Google Devs on Air to bring you this series of this webinar series with select CTOs and tech teams from across Africa to share their stories around what they're doing, what tech they're working with. And I think more importantly than ever during this time of COVID, it's important to continue to connect with different people and share stories and to continue to grow as devs in our ecosystem. So with that brief intro, I'd like to invite our moderator for the day. That's John, and he can moderate our session today. Karibu, John.
Fantastic. Thank you, Max. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to our third webinar hosted by Google DevRel and DeCodEd. As Max mentioned, this is a 6-part series covering topics which we think would be relevant for you as software developers looking to grow your skills and careers, as well as those thinking about transitioning into tech entrepreneurship. If you're thinking about building a tech startups, what are some of the initial topics you should be thinking about as a developer? A few ground rules before we start. One, as you join the call, please remember to turn off your mic and camera. If you've got any questions, please post them on the link that has been provided on chat, and we will address them at the end of this session. You can also vote for questions which you think would be important for you, so you can do that on the link that has been provided. With that, let's jump straight into today's session. Quick intro from my end. My name is John Kimani. I am part of Google's developer relations team. My team works with developers and startups who are building products using Google Tech. Our goal and team's mission is to help you be successful on Google's platforms, right? So ensuring that you have access to the right resources, to the tools, to the documentation, to the technical documentation that you would need, and also community, which is important when you're building your dev skills. And so that's what my team does. Today we're joined by Cynthia and Jonathan, and I'll be introducing them shortly. But today's topic is really looking at how do you design and build an application that scales gracefully. As developers, we've seen or had cases where a new application kicks off really well, and the feedback that you get from the early adopters is very positive. As the user base grows, expands, you start to notice this drop in usage, and all of a sudden the users that you had are becoming frustrated and complaining about the application's performance. If it's a web application, for example, you might be noticing that the page load times are all of a sudden quite high. It's taking longer for users to access what they need, the content that they need, the performance that they need. If it's an Android app, requests are getting timed out, or the app keeps crashing as you expand your user base. So to help us understand what scales means and guide us through this conversation, I'm joined by two speakers. Cynthia is a product manager with Sandy. Cynthia, I'll just give you a minute to introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your tech, tell us a little bit about your tech background, and then pass over to Jonathan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is doing okay. My name is Cynthia Nyango, and I'm a product manager and entrepreneur. So I started my journey in tech after high school. I started developing immediately, and I used to write Ruby on Rails. And then in the middle of it, I started a startup that was not so successful. I won't go into the details of the startup, but then in that moment, I realized that I loved building products, but also I didn't enjoy writing software. So I started finding a niche. How can I build products while not actually writing the code? And that's when I bumped into product management, where I work with UX designers, engineers to build products, work with marketing to push the products to customers. Yeah, so that's basically what I do. I have experience working building products for scale. So how for internationalization, how do you take your products to other countries, adding more users, different dynamics to that product while still ensuring that the same product can scale. So yeah, that's where I am at with product management. Looking forward to interacting with you all during this session.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cynthia, for joining us. Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, John. And Kolas has background. Started probably about 10 years ago. I was initially a CTO at a company before about a customer engineer, which meant I'm working with customers at different scales, from very, very large enterprises to smaller startups, helping them understand the nuts and bolts on how to build their systems, design their architectures, deploy their applications on Google Cloud using the best practices. Most recently, I was very briefly a CTO at a fintech company, also in Nigeria, but right now I'm back in Kenya, working on something else, which is a story for another day. Good to meet you all, and looking forward to interacting with you all.
Cool. Thank you for joining us. So let's get started. And the first question is for you, Cynthia. This conversation around scale. As I look to build my application and move from idea stage into my first MVP, what should I be thinking about in the early days? What does scale mean at that point? And what are some of the things that I should be thinking about?
Okay. Yeah, so this is something I've actually pondered on the whole of today. So in a situation where you're just a developer and you want to push a product to the market, you're not thinking about hiring a product manager, and product management is not something that you maybe are skilled in or you want to go into. You're just developing it. So I would say, looking at it right now, I would probably consult a product manager to just get me started thinking about scale. So scaling from a product management point of view is looking at all angles, at who are our current customers, who are the customers that we may be targeting to in the next few months, next few years. What if, how can the product change throughout as time progresses? So that's sort of the product management perspective. What if we go to another country? And initially, when you're writing requirements for this particular product, these are all factors that should be considered. So early on, from a product management point of view, I would say you really have to throw in everything. You should not think about it as, okay, I'm going to just have requirements for this set of for now, and then not think about for future. So you could have everything. So this is how I'm looking at it. In future, we might do this and this and this. In future, we might want to scale, and this is what we need to build for the future. When the time comes to developing it, then you decide what is the scope of the current work you're going to do, while keeping in mind that you have maybe version 2 or version 3 that you could look into building in the future. So it just doesn't, I would say you have to think about it from, in my perspective, from product management perspective, it's something you have to think about it from the word go. So I think Jonathan might be able to expound on it from a developer perspective.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, just to add on that, one thing which product managers always keep at the top of their minds is, what is the future going to look like? How are we going to reach all of our users, all of our customers? From a tech perspective, many times you are in the weeds, you just want to get something out of the door, get it into people's hands. That's why I'll double down on that point, that it's good to have that full picture coming from the product point of view, that this is where I want to go in terms of product. And then similar philosophy, now that once you have that perspective, once you know where the future is going, then you can now start to lay the groundwork of, okay, what architectures make the most sense for what you're doing. And then this depends, again, on the application, probably we can dive more into that. But yes, again, just to emphasize, architectural decisions based on the technology being driven by what the product vision is should also be thought about right from the onset.
So it feels like in those initial days, you're grappling with all these questions around what the future will look like, and being able to get a good idea of what features you want on your application, or even just a sketchy idea of where you want to go with the application is important. And some of these decisions will guide your product decisions early on. Cynthia, I liked what you touched on in terms of being able to move quickly. And one question we get is, how do you strike that balance between I want to move fast, but at the same time make sure that my application will not crash or die 3-6 months down the road. Do you have some insights on that?
Yeah, so that is usually a very tricky situation. So a product manager would lay it all, like, this is what we want to do. And then an engineer looks at it and says, like, Cynthia, this will take 3 months. Looking at the business objectives, the business needs this feature rolled out like as soon as possible. So then a hard decision has to be made. Most times we'll go by fulfilling the business objectives. And the risk here is that you might create a lot of technical debt along the way. And covering technical debt, I'm sure most developers would agree, is something that is hard, takes time, because once you start the pattern of, okay, let's just do this, we might do the rest later, let's not think about scale, let's just move fast now, that technical debt grows. What I could advise, or what has worked for me and my team, is that once you have a master documentation of how the feature looks like or will look like, including matters of scale, then you decide that, okay, we don't have time to do this, so you chop it down, version it, scope it, so you have version 1, version 1.0, and what you do, you have to regularly So I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, that's fine. So one thing that has worked is that you have to document each and every trade-off that you make. So once you have a document that has everything that you want to do, when you are making trade-offs, document those trade-offs so that it's easy to go back and actually see why you made a certain decision and pick up whether you want to now do the scaling part once you fulfilled the business objectives or not. Yes.
Fantastic. And it's actually a good thing you've touched on trade-offs and some of the decisions they need to make early on. And Jonathan, this question is for you as well. From an engineering perspective, what does scale look like at those initial days? And then also, as we're thinking about trade-offs, what are some of the trade-offs I'm grappling with in the first days? Is cost one of them? How should I be thinking about the cost of scaling, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally, especially when dealing in the cloud, in public clouds, you'll find that the most scalable solutions start to make sense economically once you reach a certain scale. So once you start off, you may pick a solution which scales better than others, but that initial cost upfront is many times a barrier, especially if you are a small team, maybe no funding. It's just, I've seen it be a bit prohibitive. So that's definitely, cost is definitely a factor, and that depends on resources, budget, and whatnot, and the let's say the flexibility of business and products to be able to meet in the middle and make some trade and come to an agreement. That's a point of discussion there, because okay, engineering, you need budget if this is where we want to go, and if that's what we're going to do now, you need to get everybody aligned and everybody on board. Okay, to go to your first question about what does scale mean? It from my perspective, it depends. It depends on the context and it depends on the application. Your application may be serving consumers, in a particular market, in multiple markets, worldwide. All of those have different challenges. You'd use different solutions depending on what scale you're talking about. A solution may be focused on enterprises, maybe a handful of big enterprises. Say you have a SaaS offering. Their scale also looks very different. And also the metrics which would determine the things that are important when you scale could also look different. So you look at the consumer side, maybe latency of your application, page load time, all of those things are important. If you have a SaaS application, maybe the other things that are important in that context, maybe it's not so much, well, how fast is this page loading? But if somebody is giving you a dump of their data every day, how quickly can you process that? And so it's all context dependent, depending on what it is you're doing. But then once you have that defined, and once you know where you want to go and what scale looks like, you have to be very, very disciplined in being able to, number one, understand the path to get where you want to get to, even if you don't have the resources right now. There many times is a path as you think through. Okay, I use technology A here; it's going to get me. In the future, it's not going to lock me in, or it's going to make me flexible enough to be able to move. So you have to start being disciplined about those kind of discussions, and also testing. So you want to scale. This is what your scale looks like. These are the metrics that are important. You have to test against those metrics. If it's a number of page views, page hits, you have to slam your application constantly in a test environment just to see how it behaves, even if your architecture is not set. But at least you have that reassurance that it is tested, and you also know the path that you need to take to be able to get to the point where you are as scalable as you want to.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm wondering, Cynthia, from a product management perspective, what trade-offs are product managers willing to live with, especially at those initial days? Funding is a constraint. We might be launching from a Linux box in the office, and so we're trying to keep costs down. But at the same time, our product manager has this list of features that they would like us to work on. What are some of the trade-offs that product managers also think about?
I think time is a trade-off. Time is usually the biggest factor when it comes to scale. Yeah, because product managers will think about it end to end. UX will design it end to end, but then we might not be able to do it. So most times you find that you have to scale down on a feature because of time. Also, something else that you have to trade off is user experience. I know it's not a glamorous thing to trade down or to trade off on user experience, but sometimes you have to think, how can we achieve the same thing using a less sophisticated way, or how can we just simplify while maintaining the same user experience for customers, for the people you're building for. So mostly it's time, user experience, and also the business objectives. I find that most of the time the business objective has to be met, because that's why we are building to also meet the business. We exist to also meet business objectives. So sometimes we have to go back to the business and tell them that we don't think this is actually possible. We can't target this number of customers you guys want to target because we are not there yet on the tech side. Yeah, so those are some of the top 3 things on my mind that we usually have to trade off on. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's a good thing you actually touched on users, because the next question was focusing on users. And one of the biggest struggles for a developer is truly understanding what a user wants, especially for B2C applications, for consumer-centric applications. So I wonder, to what extent does my target audience or my target user base influence my design choices? Or some of the decisions I make in the early days? To what extent should I be thinking about the eventual users, for example? I would imagine that a B2B scenario might be different from a B2C scenario. To what extent should this be a factor?
That sounds like a product question.
Yes, it
Jonathan,
does.
You can chime in as well.
Okay, you can go, Jonathan, and then I can also add on.
Okay. So in in an organization with not necessarily fully fledged, but with a product team and business dictating, yes, users influence everything, because you get together the product team and you figure out what to build based on the priorities and all the research that is done. Now engineers, at the end of the day, have to think about, again, those metrics that matter for the users: reliability, scalability, security, depending on what you're doing, privacy, depending on what you're doing. Those are the nuts and bolts that will actually make the product, the tech, deliver on what the users want. Aside from, they want, a page that does this with these buttons, but those fundamentals which actually make your product work, perform well, and inspire that confidence in the user. Those are the things which then may, as they may be unspoken, they make the tech, reliable and the product successful at the end of the day.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jonathan has said. Also, looking at it from a product management point of view, in the early days, you'd want to build with your users. You'd want to spend time with your users, know their motivation, understand their way of life, so that you don't end up building or designing products that they end up not using it, or they don't scale because you didn't really understand your target customers. So I would say that's why initially, before anything goes into development, when you have like a fully fledged product development team with product managers and UX guys, there's a lot of research that goes into the initial days for trying to understand your customers. Also, the other thing is, you don't build to completion. You don't start building a product today from you design it and then you build it end to end. There's always an MVP, of course, that you take back to your customers, and you get feedback, and that feedback helps you to grow and scale your product. So I would say you have to spend time with your customers in the early days, learning about them, and build with your customers in mind. And also, don't build products to completion. So always build, ship, test. Build, ship, test with your customers, and also do actual tests. Yeah.
I like what you said around you don't build to completion. It would always be a sort of phased approach, and so keeping that in mind is super important. We'll just take one question before switching to the audience questions, and that's on architecture. Last week we had a conversation around choosing the right tech, and I just wanted to touch a little bit on what extent will my tech choices in the early days impact my scale outcomes. You hear these conversations with developers that some programming languages don't scale very well. If you're looking at a cloud environment, for example, people will say hosted services are slower than compute engines, all those things. So the question is, at what point should I be thinking about getting my architecture right? Right, especially from a backend perspective. My application is up and running. What are some of those initial architecture conversations I should be having with my team? I think Jonathan, this is flashing your eyes.
Yes, very, very much so. You have to think about your architecture every step of the way. You won't have the perfect architecture on day one, but you have to be able to understand the path to get to where you want to get to architecture-wise. So, for example, today a lot of people are talking about containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, etc. And starting out on day one, you may be faced with the decision of, hey, okay, everybody's talking about this Kubernetes thing. Should I just go ahead and build and deploy on Kubernetes? Well, to deploy on Kubernetes, the minimum number of machines you have to have is 3. Well, that's the recommended amount. You can have less, but you should go with 3, which already increases your costs by 3x. That is if you could only run on one machine. But you can, from the get-go, utilize containers and deploy the containers on a virtual machine. And that will make your path towards using something like Kubernetes or some other container orchestrator in the future a bit simpler than deploying just straight on the virtual machine with all of the dependencies. So it's decisions like those which you have to start to think about. Okay, what is my path going to be to where I want to be in the future? Another common one is managed services, hosted services, because people fear, well, in the beginning, they're very attractive because they are easy to get up and running, they're scalable, they appear scalable, but some of these things, especially proprietary platforms or platforms that are not open source, could end up locking somebody in, making it difficult to switch to a different platform in the future if that's where they want to be. So yes, in summary, you definitely have to think about your architecture. It's not going to be perfect on day one, but you have to understand what the path towards your picture of perfect looks like, and be able to implement what can be implemented at the beginning stages.
Fantastic. I think one general thing that comes up is one, in the early days, you have to understand where you want to go, and then also embrace the fact that stuff won't be perfect when you're getting started, and work on a plan of sort of incrementally growing on your scale plans, your architecture, your versioning, and getting all those aspects right. So let's switch over to a couple of questions from the participants. And Cynthia, there's one which I think is for you. Is it possible to become a product manager without specifically starting out as a programmer? Can I leave uni today and join product management?
Yes, I think everything is possible under the sun. Oh, anyway, true, that's true. But also, I think you can become a product manager without having a background in software development. I just think it's for me, it's better because I get to understand my engineers and work with my engineers very well because of my knowledge about software development. If you don't have this knowledge, I think you could build very strong relationships with the engineers that you work with, such that you're able to really understand or even have an idea of what they are doing. So you're able to empathize with them when they tell you that, okay, this thing will take long, or we cannot implement this design because of this and this. You really need to get into their world in order to understand how they communicate. Yeah, so I would say you can be a PM without having to have engineering background. I know a bunch of PMs who do not have any engineering background, but then they have managed to build relationship with the engineers they work with. Yes. So it's possible, very much possible. Yeah,
it is possible.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Interesting question here around business requirements. How do you build a scalable architecture in an environment where the business model keeps changing? And this is something we see a lot with startups, for example. You start off on one path and then realize actually you should be building or focusing on a different audience segment, for example. So how do you design your architecture? How do you build with this kind of changes in mind, where the environment around you is changing on a daily basis?
Yeah. From the development perspective, that's always tough, and that also speaks to the agility of your development process, the agility of your team, and also looking at the more agile aspects of how you develop, of the infrastructure you choose, and how you choose to deploy applications. But it's let's say I see more of the risk on the code side, on the software side, rather than the infrastructure, unless things drastically change. But if it's a question of is it market A or market B, user A or user B, but it's still an app, still a web app, still a mobile app, then you can, again, context depending, but generally it seems like you can think about just general good practice about what a scalable architecture looks like for that kind of application you're delivering. And then, yes, it is painful to completely rewrite a feature, change a feature. That's a lot of development work. Yeah, but the architecture at least allows you to be agile and be able to release things quickly. If the mode of delivery is totally different, you're moving from a cloud deployment or to an on-premise deployment or desktop deployment. I mean, that's like, complete 180. Then it's much harder. But in as much as, yes, the business changes, the requirements change, but you have an architecture that can allow you to be agile. Yes, you still bear the pain of having to rewrite everything, but if you have a standard architecture that can handle that can at least reduce some of the pain.
Yeah. So from a product management point of view,
we've got some background noise. For everyone joining the call, please remember to go on mute.
Okay, so I think business models change. Business strategies, target customers, they change from time to time, and they can change a lot. And I think it's best to just have from the engineering side to understand that sometimes, and don't quote me, sometimes the business does not really understand what they need or what they want. So everyone is just figuring out things on the fly. So how do you also, something to think.
Cynthia, it seems you've gone on mute. We can
okay.
Sorry about that.
Where had I gotten to? Anyway, so my point was a lot changes during the whole product development process, and I think on the engineering side is to just understand that yes, these changes may come a lot more often. So how are you able to adapt quickly to such changes? So how do you build such that your code or applications can adapt to changes very quickly? Yeah, in the context of an agile environment, if it's early days, it means you're changing a lot. There are lots of moving parts. Yeah.
Absolutely. So agility is super important when you're getting started. Jonathan, we've got two questions for you. One is this conversation around microservices and building monolithic applications. And right now it seems like every backend developer is thinking about microservices. Do you want to touch a little bit on that? And whether that's an important architecture conversation to have when you're getting started?
Okay, yeah. So microservices significantly increase the complexity of an application. Because you're now managing different components. They all have to be monitored. They all have to be taken care of. They all have to be updated. It really makes things complex. So this is now coming back to the trade-off discussion, especially initially. Okay, you have your idea. You're kicking off. You want to build something. Get it out. Definitely easier to build a monolithic application. Okay, but then again, what's the path towards getting where you want to be, assuming things don't change drastically? What is the path to get to a microservice architecture? You don't have to drastically break down the application initially. Can all fit probably in a Django project, Ruby on Rails project, and which is fine. A lot of people do, at least from my perspective, because that gets you out of the door quickly. Your constraint is also your team. The minute you have multiple services, multiple different microservices, even context switching for the individual developer, at least I've found there's a cost there. If your team is not big enough, where it makes sense for teams to take ownership of different services, then that context switching happens a lot, and it just becomes messy and it's complex. For big applications, for small applications, I would say there's nothing inherently wrong about using a monolith. Again, I think about what performance metrics are important to you. How is it going to scale? What are the metrics that are going to be important for your customer? And if a monolith can handle that, then that's fine. It makes your life easier as a developer, that's fine. But if you think about, okay, this how your team is going to evolve, is this likely to be a very large application? Is this likely to be an application that's going to handle a lot of load? Yes, then it's probably worth thinking about how you can be smart about the choices you make initially and what kind of barriers you can start to implement at the get-go. But when you're first starting out, I think the reality is things change so quickly. It's very difficult to make those bounds. But keep reevaluating the architecture, and as things settle down, start to understand what are the logical bounds you can start to split your architecture up by, if it makes sense, and if that's where you want to be in the future. That's what I would. Yeah, that's my take. That's my take on that.
Cool. One more question for you, and then we'll give you a break. Something you touched on, a question that comes up when developers are choosing what platform to build on. And there's someone who says that Firebase GCP seems to be a good backend option to get up and running quickly, but the developer is concerned about vendor lock-in. One, is it a legit problem when you're getting started? And is there a way you can build your application such that I can, if I'm not happy with the platform I'm using, I can take them out and run with another platform?
Yeah, okay, good question. I'm not an expert on Firebase, so I can't speak too deeply about that, other than a lot of people use it. Yeah, in terms of lock-in, okay, yes, it is a cost to move things from one platform to another. Even across clouds, even if you're using open source platforms on both clouds, there is a cost. But there is also, but I think most people fear that cost, especially when things are in flux and things are changing and they're not willing to make a big bet. If you're in a position to make a bet on the technology, okay, using Firebase, this is what you want to, these are the features you like, and you've done your evaluation, and this is where I think my app is going to go, and you're happy with that, then fine, it works for you. It's giving you some kind of competitive advantage. There's nothing inherently wrong about using one platform, even if it's not open source, other than you may want to switch in the future, and things may be a bit more complicated than you'd like. But if that's not a concern that's keeping you up at night, and the scope and the scale of your application, then there's nothing inherently wrong with using one platform or another. In fact, most times these platforms have proprietary technologies, because those technologies are differentiated. And if you are using a differentiated technology and it's giving you some competitive advantage that's making your business better, then why not go for it?
Cool. I have Cynthia. Are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. I have one tough question for you. There's a question asking, engineers will always want higher pay, which is difficult when you're starting out your company. As a product manager, as a product lead, how do you struggle with this question of higher pay for developers? How do you ensure that your engineers are happy and that they won't bail on you before the MVP is out of the door?
I'll answer it in from 2 points of view. One, I'll answer it from someone who started a startup. So early days, you have 3 F's. So you have friends, fools, and family. So you could team up with your campus buddies or your friends who have the skills, and they are able to you get them to buy into your vision, and you guys work together. So like early days, I had my brother working for me for free. We didn't have money. So you could get people to buy into your vision and just work through the whole process until you get funding and you're able to reward them very well, or give them share options. From a product management point of view, even when it's not early days, I have engineers who feel that they are being undercompensated, and what you do is just keep advocating for them that they get paid according to their skills. Of course, you and the lead engineer are able to evaluate their efficiency, their skill level, and you're able to make a case for them. yeah, so those are the things I would do. And also maybe you could give them more value, like you could give them another value proposition apart from money. So maybe a more challenging role that they get to grow and see that, okay, I'm here and I'm being undercompensated, but I'm actually also learning a skill that I could get paid for higher in the future. So those are just practical examples from my experience that I have done to circumvent that whole scenario. And of course, if they want to leave, you can't stop them. You also have to let go and accept that this wasn't the best place for them, or it was the best place, but you are not able to keep them, and also be willing to also let go. Yeah, but I think first do the first things that I have said, and then see if they can buy into your vision, if you can give them more value than money at that point to make them stay. I would say also do that. Yeah. I hope engineers don't come. I hope engineers don't come for me.
They'll forgive you. They'll definitely forgive you.
Don't
And
come at me.
there's actually a follow-up question that connects to that, which is we were talking about this environment where everything is fast changing, especially for a company that's just getting started. So how do you ensure that you're not stressing out your team, right? Because the product roadmap is not quite clear at that point, and the business environment or the business requirements are changing so fast. So every weekly stand-up, every Monday morning stand-up is different from last week's. It doesn't feel like you're making progress, and there's always this new things that you have to focus on. Are there some tips you could share on keeping the team going and they don't stress out?
Yeah, I think also it's you as a leader, or as an engineering lead, or as a product manager, just strategically positioning yourself. So you want to position yourself as a leader who is shielding the team. So you're not a messenger delivering news every other week to your team, but you are part of them. So when these decisions come and there are changes, you need to also get on board with those changes, understand the reason for such changes, and also communicate those changes to your team. So you need to find a very good way of buying in the team into to those changes. Even if they don't see it, it could be that maybe the business has decided they want to play the long game and not the short term. So with time, it will all make sense, and you have to really not be the messenger, but be part of the message and get your team to buy in, because at the end of the day, all of you are working towards a common vision. Then the other thing is always be flexible. So flexibility and agility, don't get attached. I think that's something that I have learned the hard way. So your team, from a product manager perspective, these guys are not your babies. They are also employed to work there. So things are bound to change, products are bound to change. So you have to be flexible and agile, and you need to communicate the same flexibility, such that if things change, your team is flexible enough to really adapt quickly and keep on chasing the company vision. So be part of the message, be part of the change, and also embrace flexibility and agility.
Absolutely, it's important as a team lead to always lead at the front, so that way you're always motivating your team. I see quite a number of questions around jobs and team management and working on engineering teams, and I just wanted to point out that we've got a session in the next 2 weeks that will be covering team management. We'll be speaking with a couple of team leads, dev team leads from startups in Nairobi. So please look out for that. I want to take the conversation back to scale and architecture, and I'll take 2 audience questions before we wrap up. One question for you, Jonathan, is around, again, coming back to that notion of scaling later. And someone is asking, is it practical to build fast and scale later? Building scalable web apps from the start is sometimes a long shot. It's difficult to do, considering the chances of it going the right way. Is is it possible to just get something out of the door and think about scale later?
You always, I mean, you have to think. You always have to be thinking, and you have to make the best decision you can with the constraints you have at that time. So, the reason why you won't build the most scalable product on day one is because of resource constraints, budget, and complexity, and manpower. You're pretty much short at all of those. So you can't in that scenario develop your perfect architecture. So given your constraints, what are some decisions you can do, or decisions you can make, and things you can do at that point to be able to make your life easier when you want to re-architect the way you want to re-architect. So again, it depends on the context. I gave the example earlier about the containers world. That's something about one pattern that you could consider. If you're using a managed service, many times you don't even have to worry about scale. If the idea of scale is in line with what you think of it, if you're using App Engine, for example, it's just deploy once and you kind of never have to worry about it. So so just to summarize, yes, you're never going to be perfect on day one, but you have your constraints. Think about what you can do to make your life easier in the future, and think about the ecosystem of different platforms that you can take advantage of also to kind of make your journey smooth as you move towards scale.
Cool. We seem to have run out of questions. If you've got any additional questions, you can post them on the link that we've shared. Our speakers will be going back to the list and answering any questions on that list, so we can cover that later on. Before you leave, please do share your feedback with us. We've got a feedback link there that I've shared with you. Please just take a minute and give us your feedback. What sessions would you want to see in future? What topics would you want us to cover? And we will definitely prioritize that. With that, thank you so much, Cynthia and Jonathan, for being our main speakers today and sharing your knowledge with us. We truly appreciate that. And for everyone else on the call, thank you for joining us. And please remember to join us next week for a different topic altogether. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a night. Enjoying.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
It was very educative. Thank you.
Thank you, Juma, for your feedback. Okay.